There I am. All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to attempt something that I haven't attempted before. And so I appreciate those of you who showed up this morning to watch me ramble. Peace, everybody. Um, and basically, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about a brief section of the Counterinsurgency Manual. This is joint publication 3-24. It has been effectively the counterinsurgency manual of first the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, and now the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff. So basically, all branches of um, you know, government that are responsible with, we could say imperialism, right? We could say U.S. military activity of all kinds. Um, for more of a background on that, I suggest folks check out the conversation we had with Dylan Rodriguez a couple of months ago. Um, there was a version of it that didn't have the best audio, and we kind of cleaned that up a little bit. I hope my audio sounds okay this morning. Let me check that real quick. All right, looks okay. Um, and so that'll give background. It talks. We went through like the introduction to the manual. Obviously, some of you who are listening to this also participated in the study group that we just wrapped up recently, where we went through the entire manual. Um, but that is a really good summary of it, and I suggest that if folks are just kind of wanting to learn more about counterinsurgency itself. So why this part? So I wanted to do a conversation about the generational approach to counterinsurgency. And this is something that I've brought up a little bit in conversations with Dr. Lara Shihai, maybe even a little bit in conversations we've had with Abood, Abdul Jawad Omar. But it's something I think that warrants more attention because it's something that we see all the time and it's something that's happening right now. It's something that's ongoing within the United States. Um, and it is something that is about to ramp up a lot as the election season comes up, because I think that if there's anywhere that we can see this quite clearly, it's in that time of year. And so, um, anyway, I'll say more about that as we get into it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read a little bit, like I will share my screen and stuff like that, read a little bit of the document. Again, these are short snippets. I welcome questions and engagement from the audience. And then I'm going to pull in a couple of different sections from the tip of the spear, as well as a few thoughts that Orisanmi Burton had sent me. He and I were, had been talking about, and we're still going to do a conversation that looks at the way that he looks at reform within the book, as well as, some of his other things that are in tip of the spear. And so in some ways, this is like kind of a precursor to the tip of the spear study group. It's certainly not something that is necessary for everybody in the group to watch. It's also not something that you need to be a part of that study group in order to hopefully get something out of. But I am going to be thinking with tip of the spear a little bit today, as well as with the counterinsurgency field manual. So let's start with the field manual. Before I do that, uh, yeah. So and I don't know that I'll stick with this. I honestly did it because one, I couldn't pin a guest down for today, but also because I kind of knew what I wanted to talk about here, and I didn't want to try to shoehorn in somebody else's analysis into the things that I wanted to sort of talk about. So anyway, and shout out, of course, as always, to Dr. Ball. All right, let me see if I can make that a little bit bigger. All right. Yeah, okay. I think that looks about as good as I'm gonna be able to make it. So I'm gonna kind of just read through this with you all, but you'll be able to see it so you can follow around. So first, I want to start with operational methods of counterinsurgency. And again, I think to get a better view of this, go watch the episode with Dylan. But there are several options to consider when conducting COIN. COIN is just short for counterinsurgency operations. General approach, network engagement, shape, clear, hold, build, and transition, which has an acronym I'm not going to say. Identify, separate, influence, and renunciation, or ISIR. Limited support, light footprint, partnering, and combined action. Each option offers a different but complementary avenue and must be weighed against the operating environment. Each option can be used individually or in conjunction with others. Negotiation and mediation and counter guerrilla operations are other methods to counterinsurgency. I just shared that part up front briefly, just to say that what we're going to talk about in terms of the generational approach is one feature of counterinsurgency, right? And so there's a lot of different methods, right? And there's a lot that the counterinsurgency manual itself gets into. There's a lot that it doesn't because it leaves it up to the sort of darker forces, I believe, like the CIA's and things like that of the world. But anyway, it's actually, for those of us who have spent time with it, it's actually kind of astounding how much they just admit to and are quite open about in terms of their activities. Um, so a generational approach. This is going to be the crux of what we're going to talk about today. So a generational approach includes activities that interact with segments of a population and seek to influence the home nation. So again, just for people understanding, this is the United States talking about its activities that it operates in other countries, right? And so when it talks about the home nation, that could be, in the case when they wrote this was largely about Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's doctrine, right? So they use it in a lot of settings. I will reiterate briefly, as the point that Dylan Rodriguez made and I made a little bit in our conversation before, is that, you know, everybody from the Atlantic magazine to your average human rights professor, to all kinds of nonprofits and NGOs were involved in the development of this manual, in the praise of this manual, in the dissemination of this manual. Millions of people have read this manual, right? And so we can read it both as understanding that this is how the United States says that it's going to conduct a counterinsurgency, but we also should read it and understand that these are processes used by counterinsurgents, which include people that operate within the United States, very much so, right? And the involvement of US media in the development of this should also cue us to, and there's discussion of this within the manual I'm not going to get into today, of the propagandistic nature of the United States media with a counterinsurgency focus. One other thing I want to say quickly, I should have said at the top is that insurgency and counterinsurgency are their words, right? And I don't think that we within movements that aspire towards a revolutionary horizon should just adopt one. We should look at this manual very critically, and we shouldn't just adopt the terminology that they use. I'm largely going to use their terminology today because I'm discussing their manual, but this is a manual for how to conduct counter-revolution, right? And I think that's important for people to understand as well. I think that the problem sometimes of using the terminology of counter-revolution is that there's not always a revolutionary movement present, right? And they'll conduct these operations anyways, and we'll kind of get into that as we discuss this as well, right? But I think that as people are thinking about this, they should associate within the U.S. government context them thinking about revolutionaries as at least among the insurgent population that they're seeking to conduct counterinsurgency upon, right? Um, so here we go. So generational approach includes activities that interact with segments of the population to influence the home nation, to educate and empower relevant home nation population groups to participate in legal methods of political discourse and dissent. Just to underscore that again. The government is trying to get targeted populations to participate in legal methods of discourse and dissent, right? Generational approach activities are also a response to a common goal of many insurgent groups to attract youth into its ranks, right? We'll get to the Panthers later, but like this is why the FBI cared about the free breakfast program. It wasn't just that they were providing meals to kids, right? It was because they were providing political education to kids while they were serving them food, right? I think sometimes people miss that important distinction. Um, a generational approach provides alternatives to youth to join and support the insurgency. I find that sentence a little weird because it's like, are they saying alternative ways to support the insurgency or alternatives to joining and supporting the insurgency? I think it's the latter. It's interesting to read it as the former too, but it also empowers youth to protest in nonviolent manners and participate in development and decision making in their communities. This robs the insurgency of a disillusioned population from which to recruit. Again, this is like critically important stuff to understand, right? They're saying that in order to combat insurgent activity, that they need to get people involved in work to develop their communities, to make decisions within their communities, right? Now, this doesn't mean we should never conduct those types of activities. And this is again where I want people to read this manual critically, right? Because in some ways, counterinsurgents and insurgents or revolutionaries are fighting over um, legitimacy among the same segments of the population. And you might conduct activities to bolster the legitimacy of your group to build relationships within the community, build credibility within the community. And so there are ways where I don't want people to read this and say, well, every activity that it identifies as counterinsurgency is always counterinsurgent, right? Like, I think that's an important distinction to make. Um, but it's important to understand that they are trying to do these things, right? That they are trying to funnel people into nonprofits, that they are trying to funnel people into supporting development activities, to coming to listening sessions and talking about what they want in their community, right? That they are trying to get people involved in peaceful and legitimate means of protest, dissent, and discourse about what their community should look like, right? If it is assumed that most insurgencies last for years, then it becomes important not only to influence the present day leaders, but also for the home nation to form and mold the next generation of leaders to become peaceful participants in the existing form of government. Hugely important, right? They recognize that, if we think about it as in revolutionary struggle, they understand that revolutions are long processes, they're decades long, right? So their goal is to separate our children and our parents from us, right? And so again, this severing of generations, this is the critical aspect, this is the crux right here of the generational approach. um a note of caution associated with the generational engagement: the population or youth groups may demonstrate and protest the very government the counterinsurgent hoped they would support. However, this might be a failure rather than a success. So again, like they're saying, they're talking about this in the context of supporting other countries, usually with governments that they've established, to quell insurgencies within their countries. And they're saying, hey, you might not want people to protest you, but you actually should. You should actually look at it as a success, right? If people participate in quote unquote peaceful protests, right? Because that means that as the next line says, as expected in functional societies, mass mobilizations and protests are preferred reactions to government failures instead of violent resistance or coup attempts. To ensure the youth don't become future insurgent fighters, it is important to create channels for youth leaders to interact with their elders and power brokers in their own communities. All right. Again, I'm going to skim through a little bit of this next part, but many insurgencies are generational affair for families, and children are taught at a young age to fight for the insurgency cause. This creates problems when the conflict ends, as many of the fighters only know war, and few, if any, have skills to make a living, making DDR more difficult. So DDR, I'm going to get to in a minute because I think it's worth explaining because they also see DDR as part of the approach. So I'm not going to talk about every aspect of counterinsurgency, but I will also come back to DDR and explain what that acronym means also. Um, the generational approach seeks to influence segments of a population to understand the benefit of participating in peaceful means to address their core grievances, getting youth to understand the legal means they have to address root causes of conflict is a critical tool for reducing violence. If commanders and staffs believe insurgencies may occur over extended periods, then some efforts should be made to interact with this next generation of leaders who can establish a lasting peace. Interaction with intellectual elites of the country should also be a consideration. It may this They may be residing in the country of conflict or in another country that has insignificant influence over that has significant influence over the insurgent cause. So here they're thinking about the diaspora of countries. Countries that are undergoing revolution, countries that have undergone counter revolution, there's displacement of diaspora, right? You can have your spokesperson that speaks up. I think a good example to think about this is Iran, actually. Like how many, or even like we could talk about North Korea. We could talk about the DPRK, right? The way that in the United States, the only voices that we ever are allowed to hear about Iran or the DPRK in any mainstream media are people who are very critical of it, right? Now, people can think whatever they want. They could study those situations on their own. They can seek out different sources. I'm not going to get into a debate with folks today about those countries, but I'm just saying the point that the United States, in both instances, very much would like to see a change in the regime and in the leadership of those countries, right? And so, who do they prop up within the media? They prop up people who are dissidents in the diaspora, right? And they think about the influence also that these people will have in on the youth, right? Um, all right. Commanders planning to use a generational approach should identify relevant target audiences within the population through JPOE. I forget what that is. Apologies. Plans and methods for conducting discourse can vary depending on the operating environment and the culture. This method is used in conjunction with direct methods as part of a comprehensive approach to combating insurgent forces. Counterinsurgents can make progress in defeating insurgent forces, but if they neglect the younger generations of the population, they may lose the war. Continued and prolonged efforts should be made to convey the idea that insurgents and the home nation are seen as positive influences. Sorry, that counterinsurgents and the home nation are seen as positive influences. Again, we could talk about celebrities with this, right? About athletes, right? About actors, right? People who come from national oppression, nations, oppressed nations within the United States and internationally, right, who are then lifted up. They're depoliticized figures. They're encouraged. They're basically commanded to be depoliticized if they want to maintain their status. We could talk about Colin Kaepernick, right, as an example of what happens when people step outside of the confines of um, what is allowable counterinsurgent celebrity football player discourse, right? The population should identify with and trust their government. Counterinsurgents' efforts are coordinated and tracked through and continued to ensure success. I'm going to bring up a little bit from this other manual because there's a secondary manual, a Marine Corps warfighting publication that's related to insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. So I'm going to look at that in a second here. Counterinsurgents can interact with and influence young factions of the population by implementing youth programs and participating in local council meetings, that should include representation from different generations of the population. All right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, see if there is yeah, we're going to bring up Daruba here in a second. Appreciate that. If, I'm just looking through to see if folks have any um comments or questions so far. Um Thank you, Tracy. Joint Intelligence Preparation of Operation Operational Environment. So that's what JIPOE stands for. Um, Darren, there's a narrative around this promotion of peaceful means among the younger generations where we of older generations are encouraged to inaction because the young people are overcoming our evils. Yeah, this is that discourse that comes out of the children will save us. You know, the children are the future. Meanwhile, the children are in little indoctrination camps, known as schools and summer camps and everything else, right? Or TV, TikTok. Um, yeah, it sounds a lot like Peace Corps does. So I would say this. So the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, I don't think it addresses Peace Corps specifically, but it addresses so many NGOs, so many partners of the State Department, of U.S. military, et cetera, right? And so the um, the point being that when they think about counterinsurgency, it's totally holistic and they're totally open about it. That it includes media, that they talk about USAID, right? US aid. They talk about it throughout this document as a counterinsurgent force, right? Which I think is funny because like some people would try to argue that like, oh, you know, that's just an aid organization. It's like, no, the US government's like, no, this is our counterinsurgency force. Like these are our like they're very open about it, you know. Um and the development, right? Development and development aid are key aspects of counterinsurgency, right? So that's other stuff that comes up in other parts of the document. I don't have time to get into all of that today. But absolutely. All right, let me share my screen again on something else. All right, this wonky graphic. Let's see, how does that look? Make it a little bigger. So this is like a funny little graphic. This is from that Marine manual that was referenced, that I said I was going to talk a little bit about. So you have the identify portions. I hate graphics like this, by the way, but I thought it was kind of funny. Identify relevant portions of the population, political mobilization of the people, encourage them with voting, education, town meetings, youth programs, host nation and coalition activities. They're addressing grievances, resolving grievances, right? That's like sort of the idea of like they're very open about this in the manual as well. They want to understand what the grievances are of populations and then seek to address them in a way that the state is okay with, that it can handle, and then recalibrate. So reform, as George Jackson says, you know, if we think of a synonym for reform, it's fascism, right? Like, or synonym for fascism is reform. Like, reform is fundamental to how U.S. empire thinks about how do we respond to revolutionary insurgent activities. Of course, the output of this is reduces violence, right? That's really not their aim, but it's kind of the comfortable, squishy, liberal way to talk about it, right? Makes it sound really good that the idea is to reduce violence, as if US empire is interested in reducing violence in the world, as this manual is like created in a time where they're seeking to destabilize the entire Middle East, right? Um, all right, and then below at the bottom you have generational engagement, education, empowerment, participation. I mean, that graphic looks like probably 5 different nonprofit organizations that I've worked with over the years, right? This idea of education, empowerment, and participation as a pathway for the youth. And why is that the case? Well, because also foundations, right? Grants, the people who bring the money to nonprofit organizations, they love this. They want to fund youth programs. They want to fund empowerment. They want the youth to be participating and to be critical and all of this, right? And so it's actually right in line, right? And I think that's the really important thing is like the if they're so open that they use non-governmental organizations or nonprofits basically in an international complex context to do these things, we know that they do these things in the United States as well. Um, this was kind of interesting. So I do always like to point this aspect out here that five principles fundamental to generational engagement. This thing uses generational engagement, generational approach, and generational engagement are totally synonymous, as is stated in the another part of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. But groups with whom counterinsurgents partner, such as non-governmental organizations, must be seen as indigenous, not as foreign constructs. We could think about this internationally, right? Like, obviously, if you're in Palestine and they send in like the Israeli school for education and empowerment, like, that's not going to really convince the Palestinian people that this is a good thing for them to send their children to. Um, nor are US empire usually welcome, right? In Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. That's why ultimately they weren't able to maintain, sort of, I mean, they still have military bases and everything else, but that's why the Taliban came back and retook Afghanistan so quickly when the United States left. It's why ultimately, a lot of US coalition partners and so on have been kicked out, right? Is because people don't want to be ruled by people that they see as foreign entities. And that could sound like really anti-immigrant. It could sound the language that gets used against the left of outside agitators, right? But there is something to this, right? And I think we could also think about it in the United States of, you know, um, programs within Black communities that are run by predominantly white folks. Like, these are not seen as indigenous to the community, right? It's understood like the colonial aspects of it are apparent to people and they sense it, right? Um, doesn't mean that they don't welcome it sometimes, right? But it does mean that it's visible, and to certain segments of the population, it's not well received. Um, and so, what is the counter to that? It means that they have to crop up and create groups that are seen as indigenous, nonprofit organizations that are seen as really striving for the improvement of a people, of a community. um, right? So that's part of the way that they would engage this. They wouldn't, if they were trying to go after the defund the police campaign, right? Say they targeted that as insurgency or cop city, right? They're going to try as much as possible to create Black Atlantan voices that are against this thing, right? And we've seen this with Cop City, right? Um, all right, independence of funding and resources are important. Support groups can lose credibility the more they are perceived as reliant on foreign funding, possibly due to a shift in priorities by a sole and influential benefactor, right? This is like why also they target the left and say that everything on the left comes from George Soros, right? George Soros does fund some stuff on the left, it's true, but like the targeting of him, they're able to create this anti-Semitic trope around him, this sort of cultural Marxism. It taps into all of these like anti-Semitic and anti-Bolshevik kind of tropes from history, right? And so that's actually, this is the other thing about this, is that they'll use um, certain tactics to point out to pit the two parties against each other in some ways, right? Like Fox News, right? Well, they'll go after all these things on the left and say it's funded by these billionaires, and then you have a similar dynamic, maybe a little bit less so on the left, but where people point out Coke money and point out, so it's like these things are true, right? But like these are also just fact, people within the ruling class that have slightly different visions of the world than each other. They both support the status quo, right? Um, All right, in selecting partners, oh, sorry. So organizations and their partners should identify alternative sources of support, including local sponsors, funding from relevant ministries, or collecting dues from members. So I actually think this is good advice in general, right? Even for insurgents, right? Is to understand that you're going to have the most autonomy and control, the most that you control your own whatever funding that you're doing within your organization, the most that you control it, and the most that it is seen as organic or coming from viable sources, both to your membership and the people you're working with, but also it is in some ways a disruption of certain forms of targeted counterinsurgency. Now, that's not a blanket statement. I'm not telling people that if some billionaire is gonna fund your organization, don't take the money if you think that you can do it in a certain way. I'm just saying that these discussions are interesting around this approach and around the idea. Really, it's connecting to sort of these ideas of like, is this a sovereign resistance or a sovereign counterinsurgency, right? Um, in selecting partners, counterinsurgents should not limit themselves to the vocal intellectual elite. If the insurgency is based on the root causes of a rural population, intellectual elites might not have legitimacy among the poor. Therefore, counterinsurgents should balance support between central leadership and local branches in the provinces or township where youth engagement is usually most important. This goes again, I think, for us on the left as well. Like, we do a lot of times feature these conversations from, intellectuals, elite folks. This is not always going to resonate with all of the people that we're trying to, be in touch with. I think we just have to be clear about that. um Expansion and membership should not be used as a key indicator of success. It can be difficult to accurately track and confirm these numbers with national organizations. A more accurate measure is the staff, number of offices, actual activity levels, and efficacy. Activity reports and photos can verify process. So, this is just kind of them talking about here how they're monitoring their growth of their own counterinsurgent forces, right? There's a lot within counterinsurgency work of like how they are evaluating, which I think should just speak to the fact that we should also be thinking about how are we evaluating indicators of success. A main role for organizations is to make the connections between local administrations and the provincial or national level government, as well as other stakeholders and peer organizations. At some point, the NGOs will not be present to facilitate government access, and the most effect and will be most effective when they facilitate cooperative and enduring relationships between the population and the government. Again, like this is just to go back to the generational approach here for a second. This is again just recognizing that they're saying nonprofits are creating this um, conveyor belt of people through protest, dissent activities, education, empowerment programs into local government engagement, into voting, into support, and then connecting those up with the state government, the federal government, etc. Right. Um, Generational. I'm gonna stop here because a lot of this becomes a rehash of what we've already covered in this. So I'm gonna shut this section down for now. Um, and so let's see. I'm just gonna look here to see. Yeah, Akuya. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute a little bit more. But yeah, schooling. I think is like a critical aspect of counterinsurgency. Um, right. Um, Good morning, Hiram. Good to see you. All right. Next up. All right. So I'm going to play a little clip from Daruba Ben Wahad now. the beginning of that. Can you all hear that okay? No audio. That's a shame. Um, okay, I know another way. I got this. Hang on. Give me 1 second. I'll get this together. Oh man, it's like making me register and verify and run my fingerprint across something. All right, all right. As usual, the forces of darkness are working to make sure that we can't hear Daruba, but I'm gonna make it happen. All right.
Which brings us back to the objective of COINTELPRO. A lot of us think that the counterintelligence program was designed to assassinate and eliminate Black leaders who were revolutionaries, who were charismatic. Nothing is further from the truth. The purpose of the counterintelligence program was to eliminate and constrict and prohibit, if possible, the realization that Black people were a sovereign people and that we could think sovereignly, not as a national minority. We still think of ourselves as a national minority and look forward to the day that the demographics of America for people of color changes, which should usher in our newfound freedom. Nothing's going to happen like that. And that's why you see that the local governors and the local state boards and the local state authorities are intent on making sure that if we vote for somebody, it doesn't matter. Okay. We always talk about voting for the lesser of two evils as if the lesser of two evils isn't evil. You see, we never talk about voting in our own self-interest. We never talking about having our own independent political party. Every opportunity and every chance that we had to launch an independent political party was sabotaged. It was sabotaged by the same misleaders and politicians who are now in power and who, like I said earlier, have no intention on empowering Black people. They want to empower themselves and the classes that they come from. So when I talk about we are not in touch with our radical history, if we were just in touch with the radical history, the difference between the struggles during the civil rights era and the civil rights movement and the struggles for human rights and Black self-determination, we would understand exactly why an independent political party is necessary, why the Rainbow Coalition idea and concept was a valid idea and concept, given the nature of America and the lockdown the two political parties have on state and local politics.
All right. So we heard, what did we hear? So first, again, like this, it's interesting the assassination point he makes, right? Because I think if you read the Counterinsurgency Field Manual in its totality, what it will say is that they do recognize there are certain people that they have to eliminate, right? And I don't think Daruba's, refuting that at all. I think he knows that. He's spoken about that. He understands it. He lived through it. Um, but what he's pointing to, right, is the the counterinsurgency or the counterintelligence program, which was a counterinsurgency program, was not designed solely to assassinate people, right? That wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose of it was counter-revolution, right? The purpose of it was to deny Black people the sovereignty to be able to have, to be able to politically self-determine, right? And so if you're taking that approach through a lens of counterinsurgency, you engage in a bunch of different types of activities. You eliminate people, you incarcerate people, but you can't do that to everybody, right? And they even recognize, I'm gonna pull up something that Orisanmi Burton sent me this morning. They even recognize that that's not always the most effective means of counterinsurgency. Within the counterinsurgency manual, again, like they restate this multiple times. It's like, hey, there's some people we're gonna have to kill, and they say it quite like brazenly, but also as just like a very simple, like we don't have to think about this too much. It's not something that that weighs on their conscience. But they do also they partly look at it as it can be a little bit ineffective because if you're just assassinating leaders, then people see you doing that, right? And then that also actually can encourage people to join the insurgency. They say that within the insurgency manual, right? Um, and so what else? So he talks, but again, he's talking about the sovereignty, right, and the whole picture. And of course, he talks about politics, right? He talks about political parties, and this is how counterinsurgency works through the generational approach, as we just talked about. He's talking about the idea, the mythology, which we've all heard this, right? That at a certain point, and this is something that the right wing hates to hear, right? But it's something that the liberals love to hear, which is that at a certain point, that the United States will be majority black and brown, and therefore it will become better on its own. This is also the thing you hear when people are like, "Hey, we need more women as leaders. If women were president of the United States, we'd have less war, etc." This idea that through diversification and slow progress, right? That I mean, Obama is like the perfect manifestation of this. That if we just work slowly enough and through the appropriate means enough. I mean, every Obama speech you ever hear basically sounds like that counterinsurgency manual, right? It basically sounds like, hey, kids. You need to. It's okay to protest. It's okay to do this, but you don't get too out of hand. Um, so anyway, where was I? So yeah, so the disruption, the disallowance of a separate political party, right? Why do we still not have a viable left wing or whatever it would be, right? I'm not here to pick, one group or another. A viable third party. We still don't have a viable third party. Every year, and we could talk about that. I mean, I think there's a real question of whether third party politics also represent their own form because again, you're playing on their terrain. You're thinking that the United States is going to be changed through these electoral means. Now, I don't think most people who engage third party politics actually believe that. I think they're doing it for other political purposes, right? To, you know, pull some forces together, try to get people to get on the same page, present an alternative to the existing duopoly, right? And so like I'm not saying this as if people that participate in that do it totally just trying to be counterinsurgent, right? I think that a lot of people who do third party politics think that we need an alternative, right? But I think part of what Daruba is also pointing at is that any time that there's an alternative that seems like it's going to become viable, that it gets disrupted and destroyed, right? And so I actually personally, just from me, it's just my opinion. People don't have to agree. um, I personally, this is why we don't talk about electoral politics a lot on the podcast, unless it's through a critical lens, because I just think it's the whole thing is designed to be a counterinsurgency effort by the state, not necessarily by everybody who participates in it, right? But that the state understands that this is a terrain that we can control and ensure our dominance. All right. pulling up some other things. So I'm gonna jump to something that Orisanmi sent me this morning. If I can find it. All right. And Ori, if you're in the chat, I hope I'm sharing the appropriate page of this. But um, so this is let's start with what this is. This is, let's see, we're on page 7. All right. So just go back to the top just to show what this is. So this is a FBI memo. It was my guess. I don't know all the history of this, but my guess is that this was something that was stolen by activists when a lot of the COINTELPRO documents were um, got taken. Shout out to people stealing government documents. It's also possible that this is part, especially because Ori had it, that it was part of Daruba's files, because Daruba, when he had one of his big cases, is actually the case that eventually led to his freedom. um, he successfully sued the FBI, and he forced, through, strong lawyering and movement work and everything, they forced the release of a lot of files associated with the Black Panther Party and COINTELPRO. Um, so this was just like, it's a summary of the FBI, memo talking about the Black nationalist movement in San Francisco. Of course, they talk about Huey Newton, they talk about Bobby Seale, they talk about some of these other, the African American Institute, the Black Panther Party, the Black Student Union, um, uh, and then they have this agitator index, right, where they talk about different militants. There's where you see Huey P, um, Bobby Seale, Nasser Ahmad Shabazz, and others, right? And Eldridge Cleaver shows up. So let me see if I can get to the point that Ori wanted me to point out here, which is like, again, they're looking at these different organizations. They're talking about them. They're talking about SNCC. They're talking about SDS. They're talking about the Black Panther Party. So here, reading again, apologies for the dated language, but this is what the document actually says. So the Negro wants and needs something to be proud of. The Negro youth and moderate must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teaching, they will be dead revolutionaries. It is not Is it not better to be a sports hero, a well-paid professional athlete or entertainer, a regularly paid white or blue-collar worker, a peaceful human being with a family, or a person who at least is being accepted than the Negro who even with the establishment may have gotten even with the establishment by burning it down, or but by but along who along with this burned down his own home, or gained for him and all his people the hatred and distrust of the whites for years to come. One way to reach the Negro youth and moderate might be through searching, examination and revelation of true goals of Black nationalist organizations, presented in a way that Negroes will realize the dangers ahead for them if they do succumb to the appeal, fear, or intimidation to which they will be subjected. Um, so anyways, I'm not sure that this is fully it. But there's a point here about, I mean, obviously you could see that part about the aspirations, right? Of we don't want people to aspire to be revolutionaries, we want them to aspire to be baseball players and entertainers. Um, but there is, I feel like, and maybe I'm not finding it, but again, the focus on education and youth programs, right? And I guess again, they're like, you can sort of see that implicitly, right? Because obviously they're focusing in that discussion on Black youth. Um, no, it's not Hoover's, Tracy. It's not Hoover's memo. It's to Hoover. right? So that's the way that I read it. It's written from the San Francisco division of the FBI to J. Edgar Hoover. Um, so, anyways, I'm gonna pull up now. Yeah. So, anyways, Boy Scouts, right? That would be the kind of most common thing within it. But there's obviously so many other examples. I mean, I've worked in education, I don't anymore, but I worked in it for a long time. And I worked for a lot of organizations that did after school programs for youth. There's nothing wrong with the after school programs. Like, they were just having kids have fun and, you know, play in the park and do art activities and do all of this, right? But it's taking their time, it's helping them believe in the system, teaching them how to be a good citizen, how to, all of that kind of stuff, right? Uh, yeah, it does sound mafia-like. It is crazy to read all of these. Uh, did you see William Buckley's name? Oh, Eric, I don't know. I can send it to you. Um, all right. All right, I'm going to move on to another aspect. But it is amazing, to your point of how brazen that they are with it. I mean, the FBI memo is, of course, something that they didn't intend to have released. The Counterinsurgency Field Manual, which is also a very brazen document, and also tailored in a very nice liberal package, is something that they did intend to have people read, right? And so you can see how the things that they do and they don't really align ideologically also. Um, all right. Next up. I just want to say something about this. So the programs, though publicly funded, are not about those things. It's usually education based in public schools. So I think I mean, I'm not totally sure of what your comment or question is there, but I would just say I think it's totally both. I mean, I think that education in the United States of America is fundamentally a counterinsurgent affair. um, it's teaching people to be exploitable labor for the most part, and also just boring kids to death, and keeping them in these spaces where they're away from their communities, and indoctrinating them with a lot of BS about the United States. Um, and so, anyways, um, other things. I did have some other stuff. Let's see if I can find it. Oh yeah, I want to go back to. Did I talk about DDR? I think I didn't talk about DDR yet. All right. Yeah, I'm going to do that next. All right. All right. All right. So DDR is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. That's what DDR says. And so again, like, just to remind folks, or if you missed the earlier part of the conversation, this is a part of how the generational approach works, and it's one aspect of counterinsurgency. But I do think it's connected to, and we'll talk a little bit more about why. So, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is the process of standing down parties to an armed conflict and the reintegration of ex combatants into civilian life. It seeks to address the post conflict security challenge that arises from ex combatants being left without livelihoods or support networks during such critical transition periods. We obviously can understand how this works within really active, you know, if you have guerrilla fighters and the conflict is over, those people have spent often decades, right, learning the tactics and strategies of guerrilla warfare. So they're saying, how do we disarm these groups, demobilize them, and get them a job? essentially get them into civilian life so that they don't go back to insurgent activities. So this part is really interesting to me. It says the UN and other international organizations generally view DDR as post-conflict activities. However, historically, DDR programs are not only possible but also desirable from the earliest stages of a counterinsurgency operation or campaign, but they should be carefully tailored to the local context. I think that's a hugely important statement. Because I think what this means, right, is the government is quite saying, "Look, hey, the UN thinks you save this stuff until after the conflict is over, that's the appropriate way to address it." The United States believes that counterinsurgency must be a proactive measure, right? That it must occur at the earliest stages of a counterinsurgency operation or campaign, and that these campaigns are ongoing. They've been ongoing, right? If we think back, I mean, there was stuff way before COINTELPRO, but if we think that COINTELPRO, was a kind of a jump in the sophistication or some of the learning that was going on within the FBI, right? Then we think that, okay, they've continued to learn from these practices and approaches. Um, and so, again, it's just to say that they're doing they're constantly trying to take people who they think could become insurgent, people who are insurgent, people who weren't insurgent, and integrate those people into civilian life as much as possible. A successful DDR campaign helps ensure former insurgents are successfully integrated back into society and do not return to insurgent forces. DDR closely coordinates with reform efforts in all sectors, and DDR planning directly ties into SSR. SSR, I put in the margins here, is security sector reform. That's too much to go into, but I think that's a really interesting too, especially if you think about some of the things that happened amid like the George Floyd summer. Security sector reform is like a way of it's basically just to put it simply, it's like reforming policing, right? It's like saying, hey, can we involve these insurgent forces now within our policing efforts in some new way, right? Um, Then there's this whole part about women. I don't they say females, which is weird language to me, but women who have been associated with guerrilla forces and need specialized assistance. It talks about, rape and physical and sexual assault during conflicts. But then it says many women find after being a guerrilla, their former communities shun them for having rejected more traditional female roles. Conversely, demobilized females can be highly valuable human intelligence, so basically agents, sources, given their knowledge of their former unit and various experiences. It gives the example of Colombia. I don't want to go into Colombia, that's a whole thing. Um, but I thought that was just interesting. I mean, I think it's interesting, one, that they're targeting. I mean, I would argue that part of the reason to target women is that women are often bases of social reproduction, right? And so they are key within, I mean, ideally, if you're thinking of Che or whatever, like men are stepping up and taking on more of those roles within guerrilla movements or insurgent movements as well, and not putting that on, the women. But nonetheless, like women tend to be cultured into a lot of those roles in societies. There's a critique here of women insurgents of having rejected those traditional roles, which is also interesting, right? Because again, this kind of connects into the long tradition of Marxist and scientific socialists and Cabral, Fanon, Che Guevara, of talking about new humans, right? New man, quote unquote, but really talking about people who then are able to move beyond these gender norms and stuff like that again. And so I think this also should be something that we think about when we hear these criticisms of insurgent groups as like overly patriarchal spaces. of, partly here you have the government saying, well, no, actually part of the problem with insurgents is that the women are not, are not, uh, rigidly enough boxed into a patriarchal role within them. Um, yeah, so purpose, it's a weird section to call purpose because they don't really talk about the purpose, but basically talking about former combatants left without livelihoods and support networks, trying to integrate them into civilian society. Then it gets to DDR of children associated with fighting forces should be conducted separately from adult DDR processes. Children should be treated as victims of human rights violations and afforded additional protection throughout the process. But this also means a severing of children from their families, right? And they're quite clear in this document too of the importance of families within insurgent, in developing the bases of insurgent. That is often the family structures that are a part of this, right? And I think we could think about that capaciously, right? Not just the nuclear family. Um, Disarmament, I'm not going to talk a lot about because it's pretty simple. It's just I'm talking about how do we get the arms away from the militants. Demobilization is more important. So demobilization is the process of transitioning insurgents from a state of conflict to a peacetime configuration while simultaneously maintaining national security and economic vitality. Demobilization for COIN normally involves the controlled discharge of combatants from insurgent forces that have stopped fighting. Demobilization under these circumstances includes identifying, notifying, and gathering former combatants for demobilization efforts. Demobilization involves deliberately dismantling insurgent organizations and belligerent groups, refocusing their loyalties to more appropriate group affiliations, and restoring the identity of former fighters to that of one who is a part of the national population. Wow. Ah. You spend it's like one of those things where like you spend all this time like trying to theorize and think about things and think about ways to explain things, and then there's a paragraph from the United States government that just explains it way better than you possibly could. Um, so anyway, um, yeah, so I put a note here of many of the weather underground. I'm gonna come back to that a minute. Reintegration is the process through which former insurgents are brought back into peaceful civil society. During this process, former insurgents enter a program from taking up arms against the government. It's weird the way this is worded. I don't think this is exactly what they mean, but I don't even know. Taking up arms against the government to receive education, training in needed civilian skills and strategies to become more socially and economically embedded in the community. So, why did I bring up the Weather Underground? I don't know if anybody has watched, there's a really good, well, it's a pretty good documentary on the Weather Underground. I think it's just called Weather Underground. Um, and one of the things that's interesting about weather, for example, is obviously it was, predominantly white folks. Many of them came from kind of upper middle class backgrounds. Some of them had like communist or socialist parents and stuff like that. Um, so there's plenty of critiques out there. I always appreciate when Daruba says, he told me he was like they were on the right side of the barricade, like and so he told me a story once of like that the children of the Weather Underground wanted him to come and speak to him or wanted him to come and speak to them, and he was, like, kinda open and but they were sorta, like, critical of their own parents and their parents' involvement, and he was like, "I'm not doing it," because he was like, "They were on the right side of the barricade." Or maybe he did speak to them and said that. I don't wanna misquote him, but anyways, that was the general gist of it. Um, and, anyway, folks could have whatever critiques, opinions, and all of that of the Weather Underground. If folks wanna read a really, I think, well-written book about them, Dan Berger, has a book that is specific to their history. I'm blanking on the name, but somebody will get it in the chat. Um, but a bunch of them became professors, and a bunch of them became, like, a bunch of them became fairly liberal in their politics. And I'm not saying that to like, to totally critique them. There's a process here that is involved in that. There's reasons why, there's societal forces, but there's also this attempt, again, if we think about DDR and former insurgents, right? A lot of the weather folks served shorter sentences than like the BLA or Black Panther Party members who were involved. Some of that has to do with some of their cases. I mean, obviously David Gilbert, who was part of weather, and then later he served, I think, ultimately the longest of anybody that was involved in the Nyack expropriation. So like it's not a total blanket slate to say like, hey, but I think sometimes people talk about this as like, oh, well, that's white privilege. The white people got off sooner, they got out sooner. I think there's some of that. But I think why would that be is a more interesting conversation. Right, and I think that the conversation has to do with whether they thought that folks could be reintegrated into civil society. In that movie that I mentioned, one of the members talks about when they started working for, I don't know what it was, Columbia or some other university, having to sign a pledge that they wouldn't overthrow the government. Right? Like, this is a very clear, like, sort of DDR, you know, um, wanna process. I don't know if Bill Ayers was one of Obama's professors or if he was a friend of Obama's or, a fellow community organizer, since Barack Obama liked to brand himself in that way. But they definitely had a relationship, and this was something, again, that was used by, the far right to make Obama seem like he was a Marxist revolutionary or whatever. But Bill Ayers did become did continue to organize. He still does, as far as I know. And again, like, this is not a critique of Bill Ayers as an individual at all. I'm just saying that this process of DDR, you can see it if you look at specific groups. And some, I mean, this happened with other folks too. I mean, some of the Panthers this occurred with, some of the young lords this occurred with, where you see them now as proponents of civil society. A lot of, again, an organization near and dear to my heart, SNCC. A lot of ex-SNCC people, when you talk to them, they will talk a lot about voting still. And I've always appreciated and understood the way that they talked about the importance of voting in their generation as they were working in the South, where people were denied the right to vote, which of course nobody should be denied the right to vote. Um, but I'm also, as I've already said kind of earlier, I have my own deep critiques of electoral politics as an avenue of social political change at this point, which is not to say that I take a totally like, within revolutionary history, there's a lot of participation within electoral politics that is combined with much more militant insurgent activity. So it's not to say like that everybody who does that is bad or it's wrong or that there's no tactical strategic consideration involved in it. I'm not saying that. So yes, this is Dan Berger's book, Outlaws of America. It is a very good book. Um, yeah, and the politics of solidarity, and that's one of the things I really do appreciate too uh, about Weather Underground, and Weathermen as an organization, but also about that book is just the real grappling with, as a- as white folks, right? What is our role in furthering revolutionary struggle? And there's different opinions. Some people think that they didn't, do it right. There should have been more mass work and that you should have been organizing white workers and this and that, right? And people have tried that approach too, right? So it's, revolution is very hard, as one of my uh, good friends would say, Ivan, he'd say revolutions are hard. We shouldn't beat ourselves up too much when we fail. Um, But anyway, I did wanna just point that out with regard to DDR because I think some people might ask the question of how do people who plot to be involved in something like Weather, which had its view of revolution, overthrowing the United States government, putting something in place, you know, etc. How does that person become a college professor? Like, why, why would they want and the right again seizes on these things, right? And says these crazy liberal universities are allowing these as communists to teach our children, right? The answer, I believe, is that it's a part of the way that the United States conducts counterinsurgency, that it believes that it is good to give these folks jobs within prominent universities, help them leave that insurgent life for a life where they can, teach kids about protest and dissent in more constrained means, where they can promote themselves as a cautionary tale. A lot of weather folks speak um, in this language of like, I don't know what we were thinking. Not all of them, but a lot of them do, right? And you hear that from different folks that are kind of involved. And I guess to go to a tip of the spear so that we can kind of start to wind our way towards closing, um, that's something that Orisanmi Burton talked about too, in terms of a lot of the people that he interviewed. Joy James has talked about it in terms of interviewing, ex revolutionaries of different groups, is that a lot of them have this thing of like, it was a crazy time and this is what we thought we were doing, but this sort of regret or we were wrong, thing. Maybe that's true. And maybe that's a part of how DDR works, right? Is that you are convinced that you were naive, that that was the times and you were, surging with the times. It doesn't make sense anymore. Go vote for Bill Clinton, um, or whatever. Uh, but anyway, I just wanted to kind of share that reflection. So I'm gonna pull up a couple of things from Tip of the Spear. These are fairly, uh, these thoughts are just from a couple of different periods in the book. Um, Again, I just will give folks a little bit of a flavor of a couple of aspects of it. Um, and you know, if you join the study group, obviously we're going to meet on Wednesdays at 7:30. I should say up front, well, I should have said this up front an hour or something ago, but the study group will not be like this. It will not be me sitting and lecturing people and pulling up slides and so tip of the spear. So Tip of the Spear is a book that Orisanmi Burton wrote. It's called Tip of the Spear, Black Radicalism, Prison Repression, and the Long Attica Revolt. We're doing it in the Millennials Are Killing Capitalism study group, which in that group, it's a lot of group discussion. Everybody reads chapter by chapter. We get together and we talk about it. Several folks that are in this, I don't know, why do we have to read 1984 Acquia? We'll have to talk about that at a different time. And so anyways, it's still open. We will start next Wednesday, Wednesday the 17th. And we'll dig through aspects of Tip of the Spear. Part of the reason I'm connecting the two is that Orisanmi Burton talks a lot. He's, for one, he's somebody that, I know, I appreciate as a person. I'm a friend of his. I at least hope so. Um, and we've had a number of conversations with him on the audio podcast that people should check out. Um, One in particular, one I should mention right now, which is the one on Black masculine care work. He's one of the things he said to me is that when he wrote that piece, he was really explicitly thinking about how these practices offered a potential antidote to this generational approach to counterinsurgency. And so anyway, I appreciate that. I kind of want to go back and listen to that conversation again. I encourage other folks to do that. But anyways, the book deals with what he calls the Long Attica Revolt, which is this revolutionary period that precedes Attica, follows behind Attica, and he's looking at what are the insurgent forces, the revolutionary forces doing during this time period, and what are the counter-revolutionaries and the counterinsurgent forces doing during this time period. And so it connects a lot to this, and it also connects, I believe, to the generational approach. Um, all right. Sharing screen now. All right. So just starting off, I just wanted to say this is, this is from early on in the book. It's from, I can't remember if it's the introduction or the preface, but whatever the first section of it is. He says at the top here, making this book tip of the spear is my response to an intergenerational assignment that Eddie Ellis and others gave me nearly a decade ago. I met Ellis in 2009 while facilitating political education workshops with the Prison Moratorium Project, an organization he helped establish after 23 years behind the walls. In 2014, when I began conducting research for what evolved into this book, I interviewed Eddie, hoping to learn about his life as a journalist for the magazine The Liberator, his role in the Harlem Black Panther Party. This is different from the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. This is actually the Revolutionary Action, or RAM formation. His experience in Attica during the rebellion, and his work as part of the Greenhaven think tank, a prison-based formation whose research influenced multiple generations of activists, scholars, and policymakers, often in unacknowledged ways. Greenhaven think tank's a whole other aspect, which in some ways, I would love to get Ori to talk about it a little bit. I think we talked about it a little bit in one of our conversations. I also know and respect some folks who have come out of that, but I think there's an interesting way in which, and Ori talks about it in the book, but Greenhaven think tank itself is a component of government-led counterinsurgency after Attica. Um, but why did I highlight this? Because he talks about the intergenerational assignment from Eddie Ellis, and I think that this is an important thing also as we think about getting to sort of combating, of thinking about the work that I'll read a little bit more here. He says, Eddie Ellis had told him, "We have never been able to use the tools of academia to demonstrate that our analysis was a better analysis." He suggested that perhaps I could play that role, that I make it my mission to use the resources of academic scholarship to rigorously elaborate a genealogy of knowledge production that today remains criminalized, pathologized, and intentionally hidden from public view. It was a transformative interview in many ways, but unfortunately, it was our last. Eddie Ellis died of cancer shortly after that conversation, right? So I just wanted to lift that up. It's something that Ori often lifts up when he talks about it, but I think that practice also of when we are, even for those of you, there's people here who are tuning in who are part of the academy, right? Which is like, how can you use those resources against the intentions of them, right? Because as he's talking about, it was purposely hidden, like the knowledge of Attica and the genealogies of knowledge and revolutionary discussion of Attica had basically been wiped out of the record of the way that we talked about Attica. And Attica is one of the most talked about incidents in the 1970s. And so why do we have all these narratives about it, right, that sort of liberalize it, that don't talk so much about the revolutionary politics, that don't talk about the actual revolutionaries who were involved, who disconnect the revolutionary activity of Attica from what was going on outside, from what was going on in the third world, from what had preceded it in other jail rebellions, and so on, right? Again, this is a part of the intergenerational approach, right? They want to take the history, and this is how education reinforces the intergenerational approach. We take the history and television. We take the history of that event and we decontextualize it from its most revolutionary events, right? And we present something that might be seen as a tragedy or even horrible, a cautionary tale, something that we learn from, but it doesn't actually deal with the fact that these are revolutionary people with, with that kind of knowledge and approach and political education and so on. Um, the PDF reader is just preview on Mac, and I don't know, it's probably a terrible one to use, but anyway, yeah. All right. Don't want to go into this part. Yeah, so just to reiterate again, like saying here, it is this relation of accountability to the intellectuals and combatants of this undeclared war, both living and dead, and to the ancestral traditions that nurtured them, that distinguishes this book from previous treatments of Attica. And I think that that's right. Right. I think that's one of the things that makes Dr. Burton's writing special for me is this dedication to the combatants, right, and the intellectuals, both living and dead, but also to everything that nurtured them to get them to where they were, right? Um, Again, and he prioritizes that he talks about how in the other understandings of Attica, the dominant understanding of Attica as a 4-day event was confined to a single prison and primarily aimed to ameliorate oppressive conditions, is facilitated by interpretive practices that prioritize knowledge yielded by state sources over knowledge produced and archived by rebels. That's an important point. So, what he's saying there is just that the way that Attica is told, and also Attica is often told as this was a protest over prison conditions, right? Which, of course, is a part of the story, but it is definitely not the whole story. And that framing only works if you don't feature enough sources of what revolutionaries that were involved in it and were supporting it were involved in at the time, and were saying at the time. Um, this is a quote from Victor Martinez, who was a part of the Attica Rebellion, who was talking. He was a young member of the Young Lords. Um, So Martinez, a member of the Young Lords, situated in this militant collective action within the longue durée of resistance to racial colonial violence, he said, "This system has oppressed us for the last 400 years, and we're here to put a stop to it," he proclaimed, his voice quivering with rage. Martinez's analysis contradicted that of DOC officials, who preferred to frame the disorder as a reaction to jail conditions, especially overcrowding, the brutal density of the environment, the fact that human beings were packed 2, 3, sometimes 4 to a cage designed for one, no doubt stoked their discontent. Martinez and others understood themselves to be engaged in a struggle that exceeded the spatial boundaries of a given institution and the temporal confines of the historical present, meaning the time beyond the present. They conceptualized their captivity as only the latest iteration of a regime that had ensnared colonized people for centuries by relocating the rebels' historical point of origin from jail conditions to violence at the core of Western modernity. Martinez constructed the rebels as legitimate political actors, indeed as anti-colonial revolutions who had taken bold and necessary steps to halt a transgenerational onslaught. Again, I just lifted this piece up because of the connection to intergenerational struggle, and also understanding that the onslaught against people is transgenerational. And I would say also, again, that this is an area where the counterinsurgency manual is quite clear that revolutionaries narrate their struggles in certain ways and connect the conditions that are going on now. We historicize them, we connect them to history. And the US government views that as a bad thing in general. They want everything to be looked at in isolation and outside of some historical context. And they're clear about that. That's again like one of the ways that counterinsurgency is conducted is to make it seem like, every time there's an incidence of police brutality, that this doesn't have anything to do with, slave patrols and slave catchers. It doesn't have anything to do with, the histories of segregation and redlining or slavery, right? That this is just, some failure of either at best an individual officer. More often, it's the fault actually of the person who was shot, right? That's the way that they would like to frame it. Um, all right, this is just another section here. So he's talking here with Kwesi Balagoon, right? This is an interesting section. It's a good one. I'm not going to get too deep into it because I want to read it with folks in the book, but it's in a moment where Kwesi Balagoon is talking about they had hostages within the jail. This was before Attica, and Kwesi was of the mind that if they threatened to kill a hostage, right, that they needed to follow through. And there were obviously many other combatants who disagreed with, not combatants, other people in the jail at the time who disagreed with this. They won out, right? So they didn't end up killing any hostages. Um, but so here Orasami is talking about Cedric Robinson, who talks about how within the history of Black Revolution and Black Rebellion, that Black people's activities are never as violent as the colonial masters, and that this, for Robinson represents a shared order of things, um, which Robinson is very sympathetic to. I also think it's just sort of a historical fact, like within anti-colonial resistance, within Attica as an example. But even, you look at Palestine right now, like nobody would argue that the amount of violence that was committed by the Palestinian resistance was in any way greater than, I mean, maybe some weirdo psycho would say that, but nobody would say that, sorry, I shouldn't say psycho, um, would say that it's greater than what the Zionist entity, what Israel has done in response. Obviously, that's greater. Obviously, the history of Zionist violence within Palestine is greater than the amount of violence that the Palestinian resistance has engaged in. But that's not really the point that Kwesi is getting at here, or the point that he's connecting the Queen Mother more, which we'd have to read the book to get into how she talks about it. Uh, you know, is that in the tradition of Queen Mother More, Kwesi sees this as symptomatic of the pathological plantation mentality that had been inculcated in Black people through generations of racial terror. Black people have been conditioned to die behind any old bullshit for so long, Kwesi wrote, that taking those white pigs' lives in response for murders of ourselves seemed to be incomprehensible to them, a crime against God and three other white men. Like theorist Frantz Fanon, whose ideas were profoundly influential to this movement, Balagoon suggests that the primary barrier to the liberation of the colonized was within their own minds, a combination of fear of death, respect for state authority, and deference to white power that had been hammered into the population from birth. Liberation would remain an impossibility as long as colonial subjects uh, respected the taboos put in place by their oppressors. Theorizing this pivotal moment at the level of ontology, Balagoon argued that what was at stake was beyond even questions of life and death. It involved the very existence of of colonized beings as beings in the world. Just gives you a sense, I think, of how beautiful Orasami Burton is as a writer there. Again, like I would say, just to draw that comparison to Palestine, because I know it's on folks' minds. I For me, there becomes no question that armed resistance is necessary within the Palestinian complex context if they want to overcome colonialism, right? And that's the point that Balagoon is making, right? It's not a matter of saying it's good to take the lives of these white hostage police officers, right? On some kind of moral, framework. It's actually just saying that um, that is the leverage that they possess in the moment, and an inability to be willing to follow through when they present the threat, right? It actually nullifies their ability to further their resistance, right? This is just kind of an interesting section. And bring it up for a second. So he's talking about this character Luckmon here. Uh, and I can't remember Larry White, I think is his actual or is his original name. Luckmon is what he goes by. So an Attica brother told me that he authored a manual for carceral guerrilla warfare while immersed in the spiritual jazz of Alice Coltrane. After seizing Attica, the rebels announced to the world that what has happened here is but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. The Long Attica Revolt was a piercing sound, one that, as Fanon tells us, infuses a new rhythm specific to a new generation of men and a new language and a new humanity. Again, like part of the reason I come to this section is because of one, it's a little bit different. I mean, there's plenty of engagement within guerrilla warfare within the text. There's engagement with um, texts of anti-colonial revolutionaries and so on. Um, but also connecting to cultural, aspects, connecting to spiritual aspects. He talks about, in this section, letters to sons, and there's another section in which he talks about Jomo Kenyatta and some of what he left for his daughter, right? Um, and so again, like where this connects back is through these channels of intergenerational storytelling, music, etc. Right, and we have these archives, right? Like we just need to spend more time with them. Like whether that's Freedom Archives, whether it's books like this, whether it's talking to these elders who are more, I mean, one of the things I would say about Daruba that I appreciate a lot is that, he's not ashamed, right, of what he participated in. He's willing to talk about it. He's willing to address the contradictions. You may not always agree, that's fine, but, like, having that perspective of elders who understood that they were right to struggle, right? And that it wasn't a matter of, we were idealistic and naive, right? It was like, no, like, what did you believe? What were you reading? What were you thinking? What were you studying? How did you develop your strategies and tactics? Let's have real conversations about these things. Um, Again, this is like later as they're talking about Attica itself, as Ori's talking about Attica itself. Um, in the chapter Attica is, which is the one he deals most with it. I'm not gonna get into that because it's a really good chapter, and we should. But he just notes here that that these models, and he's talking about Attica in this instance, but we could think about it more broadly as, the Cuban Revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, Vietnam, the Korean War, what's going on right now in Palestine, Attica, Haiti, we could go on and on, right? Algeria, Guinea-Bissau, that uh, that these present models for political forms that could be needed in the future, meaning not just the struggles themselves, right? But actually, in this case, he's talking about what was built within in Attica at the time at which the rebels held it, right? And if we think about that, again, Cuba is a great example of thinking about and learning from all of the structures. How have they defended that revolution from being completely overthrown? People could have their criticisms of it, that's fine, but like what structures are in place that have maintained the sovereignty of their party and their leadership there in Cuba. This is the other side of uh I could call it a different generational approach, the counterinsurgent generational approach. But here he's talking about how multiple generations of white male guards earned their living by lording over seemingly boundless supply of racially othered males convicted of all manner of criminalized acts, constantly reinforcing notions of inherent white male supremacy. Um, in that case, he's talking about the guards at Attica, right? But again, like this is also, I mean, Fox News, right? It's just sort of like the cultural apparatus for white people, white men, that constantly puts them in positions, whether it's policing, corrections officers, military, um, you know, whatever, management in labor, um, that reinforce their notions of superiority and the inferiority of uh, you know black and other racial subjects. So this comes from a section at the end where it's called the War on Revolutionary Minds. It connects in with one of the conversations we had with Orisanmi, where we talk about the RX program and the Price X program, which are they're COINTELPRO like programs, but the RX program is actually a program where, it's a behavior modification program. It's a program where prisoners were given drugs to see what those drugs would do to their behavior, which again, that's like a really common thing within prisons now. But at the time that Orasami is studying it, it's actually like the CIA that's involved in it, right? And so I think that's part of why it's interesting, because the CIA is involved in it and it is understood, and they're actually targeting Black revolutionaries. And so, as it stands now, Black people cannot even conceive of real freedom. We are afraid of real liberation because we have been programmed to be afraid by racist class oppression, writes Daruba. That's Daruba Ben Wahad. Although aware of behavior modification initiatives like the RX program, his critique focuses on more ordinary and thus seductive tactics of thought control, as universally sponsored education programs were flooding the post Attica prison. He wrote that quote, education has, quote, always been another method of programming Black people into the lowest strata of capitalist society, ensuring generations of exploitable and marginal labor. I'm going to read a little bit more. These institutionally sponsored education programs were increasingly competing with with the threatening forms of self-directed Black study that gave rise to the revolt. This is after Attica, just for folks who are wondering. In order to break these psychological class chains of 20th century enslavement, we must build a revolutionary culture, not not only programs our minds out of oppression, but at the same time impels us against the enemy class and culture, end quote. Revolutionaries were also talking about, quote unquote, programming the population, but unlike that of the state, theirs was not a paternalistic, elitist, top-down approach, but a consensual approach to deprogram and reprogramming besieged communities from the bottom up. All right, I'm going to leave it there for the discussion of tip of the spear, but that gets to the point that I do kind of want to end on, right? Which is part of what I titled this was countering this, right? Countering the counter or the the generational approach, right? And so I think those are some instructions for that right there. Um, that, Daruba is specifically is talking in that instance, about educational programs, about programming, but to break the psychological class chains of 20th century enslavement, right? Program our minds out of oppression, but at the same time impels us against the enemy class and culture, right? So it's not just about like liberate the mind, um, free your mind and your ass will follow, as Funkadelic would say. Shout out to Funkadelic, by the way. Um, it's not just about that. It is about being clear about who the enemy is and programming ourselves to be thinking about how are we going to collectively fight this thing. Um, and so that's that from that part. And I'm just gonna pull up some other notes I had put down. Um, I mean, I think that one of the things that really sticks out to me is also just the idea of what are we doing with our kids within movements? This is something that, my wife and I talk about quite a bit in terms of like, are we going out to this thing? Are we going to this meeting? Are we going to this protest, etc.? A lot of times, there's the question of is childcare present? I think that that's a good start. But I actually think that we need more than childcare. I actually think that we need to be, if we're doing programming and political education for the adults, that if the children are not participating in that, that they should be getting their own. And that, there's a lot of really brilliant folks within movements who are educators. I know that there's resources out there. I know that there's things that can be age appropriate, right? And I believe in the capacity of our movements and our organizations to also, yeah, we do need adult care. But to really be creative, right? Around um the involvement of youth within our movements, right? Also the involvement of elders, right? Like, how do we get more elder generations to participate? How do we have discussions with them where it's not just at the level of, I'm going to dismiss you because some of the ideas that you come with initially might be, they might be reactionary because of how we've all been programmed, right? We all live in this society. We're all undergoing this counterinsurgency. We're all subjected to this psychological warfare, right? We have to have patience with people, as, thinking about, Hiram and the things that he, I think, emphasizes among us are required, certainly of organizers, but I think also even of myself, I don't consider myself an organizer, right? Um, that not that I just don't think I have those skills, right? But that revolutionary patience with people, um, and recognizing that the design of the state is to segment out the generations, right? The generation, I mean, what the hell is a generation, right? Like, I mean, this is like some silly, like, social science stuff, really, right? I mean, we all know kind of what it means in certain thing, and as people who are from certain generations, we have certain experiences that are meaningful to us and shape us. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, we should be working for this transgenerational or intergenerational process, and not again a way to spread beyond our individuality that we're all acculturated into. um and so anyway, I did want to say that as one thing. um I think also teaching these things, working with our those of us who have children, like, how do we do this? I think it's really important to understand, like, family dynamics are complicated, right? Like, how many children of revolutionaries are like really, are just liberals, right? Just, you know, um, how many children of revolutionaries look back at their parents who were more rebellious and think that, oh, they were crazy, right? Now, part of that again is DDR, right? Their parents were trained to, that was what was that was how they made sense. It's how they were welcomed back into society, into civil society, is like through this disavowal of what they participated in. And so, but I also say that to say, like, even I think about my father. My father was a great hunter. He was a fisherman, and he's a carpenter. He's still alive. um, and I didn't pick up any of those skills, right? Because, like, of family dynamics, right? Like, some kids wanna be like their dad and some kids don't, right? And so that's why you need that. That's another reason. There's many reasons, but that's why you need that more capacious, structure than just your family to be able to have these kind of intergenerational, lessons. I mean, like, in some ways, you could think about it for those of us who come from the church of Sunday school, right? Like, what's Sunday school for revolutionaries, right? Like, how does that work, right? And in that you have other adults and other children, and they're engaging in this stuff together, and they're able to study it and draw their own conclusions and think about things. But, like, it's still guided. It's still you're still promoting, obviously, the kind of, insurgent ideals that you see, the revolutionary ideals that you see. Um, Another way I think that this counterinsurgency approach works too is through the internet, is echo chambers online. Like, we all have our online echo chamber, and I love mine. Like, I'm not, I'm not mad at those of you who are in it. I appreciate you and the things that you share and talk about. I learn a lot from people. But the internet is not the same experience for everyone. Like, those of us who they've said, "Okay, you guys are radical, so we're gonna target this content to you and put these people around you, and you can have these conversations in these spaces." Like, this is a way that they isolate us too, right? That's, I guess, something that I didn't address much within counterinsurgency, but they do have a recognition that certain people are just gonna be very radical, so the goal for them is to isolate them, right? My kids get on the internet and their echo chambers look nothing like this. Their echo chambers are full of, streamers who are talking about video games, or, jokes on TikTok, or whatever. And, like, everybody's is kind of different. It's tailored to, like, the experience that you seek out repeatedly online. But again, like, this serves in those digital spaces. It's why I think we should be very critical of the digital medium, as obviously I use it, I'm on it right now, but as, like, a means to, it's something that where we can have conversations like this, but it's not going to reach everybody. I mean, our videos, our podcasts, which get a little bit more traction than our videos, but they reach thousands of people. That's not enough, um and some of the stuff online, might reach 100 people, right? Or 500 or whatever. Like, that's, and there's people who do it better than me, so I'm not, that's fine. But I'm just saying that structurally it's designed to create these, like, smaller echo chambers, and everybody's in their own, and that is an impediment to the kind of broader work that we need to do, the cross generational, and also just reaching people who, are maybe very disaffected with the system, depoliticized, don't see themselves represented by the Democrats or the Republicans necessarily, but are not engaging in that kind of, political stuff online. Um, I think that is kind of it. The other thing I would say is, like, I was thinking about that Sunday school concept. I was also thinking about during the pandemic. It wasn't just this group of people that did this, but there was a focus, among particularly, like, suburban, uh, you know, families, among, like, pods, right? Because the schools were closed, right? So you get kids together and they learn together. And, like, so I just think also, like, there's folks obviously that are kind of in the, I think they call it unschooling or whatever, like, the people who they don't really call it homeschooling, but, and I wish I don't have my kids are both in public school right now, so I'm a hypocrite for even talking about this, but no, I think that there's something there in terms of people who are thinking creatively among people that, are in political community, of, like, how do we create spaces, even if it's supplemental, even if it's summer programs, after school programs, breakfast programs, right? Think about the Panthers. That you have to think about spaces also with kids, And obviously, I'm not meaning to say that this is just a discussion about education of children, but I am saying that we have to recognize that um, we have to be responsible for this, but also like even just the experience with my own kids of like you know, at different times, the political stuff I try to pass on to them shows up. Like I was really happy when my 16-year-old was like, "Hey, I want to go to these marches on Palestine," because he cared about what was going on and he had known that we had been a part of protests, all of his life. But like most of his life, he's like, "Dad, I don't want to go do that stuff. Right? I want to play video games." And that's you know it's not geared towards kids, and some kids might love it, but like again, just thinking about those kind of activities too. um yeah, I think I'm gonna kind of the other thing that would say too is obviously I think for many of us that the climate catastrophe that we are already living in, that is only going to get worse and worse, is something that weighs very heavy on our minds. It's also something that can produce kind of doomerism, right? Or like people just being very pessimistic because they're like, oh, we're never going to be able to change things as quickly as we need to be able to stop this or whatever. And we will or we won't. Like, but also I would say that this is something too where it's a connection with the younger generation because one, like, we can't abdicate our responsibility as adults to struggle for the better world now because, our kids are gonna look back like, "Hey, you destroyed our planet, and fuck you." Um, but also, this is something that kids actually really can be politicized by, and a lot are, but the climate movement is so caught up right now, and hopefully it'll start to break free from some of this, but it is so I mean, the Democrats and like the counterinsurgency apparatus has just funneled that thing into really useless, from my perspective. Again, people can disagree. Activities a lot of the time of these very like peaceful protests. Again, electoral, some policy stuff. Again, these are things that the state is very comfortable with. I'm not saying don't do them. I'm not saying don't engage in them critically at all. I'm just saying that, like, where that is right now, that I see the climate movement, especially where we are in the United States, is like totally encapsulated, right? To use Daruba Ben Wahad's term. And so, how do we build that and how do we see that as an intergenerational thing? I mean, even thinking about how indigenous people talk about it, about like seven generations, of a world, right? And so I think those are also important things to think about in terms of countering this generational approach. Um, all right. So, any real questions? I apologize that I missed. I'm sure a lot. Darren, thank you. Yeah, people like the video, please, if you do like it, unless you don't like it. Um, and subscribe to the channel if you're not, because also a lot of people do watch these that don't end up subscribing. And, you can subscribe it and not have notifications on if you don't want the notifications. But, uh, yeah, so this is a good point. Climate writ large has not been out for Palestine, at least established groups. I will say I've been really, and folks, please drop questions in the chat. I'm happy to get to some now because I'm done with what I had to say. I will say Greta, I'm pulling for Greta real hard because she seems to really be starting to like very much come to the appropriate conclusions around imperialism, around capitalism. I know it's bad to pull for like one individual kind of celebrity activists, but I think that yeah, I'll leave that conversation for another day around celebrity activists and stuff like that. But I do think that she's tremendously influential, and her making those connections and also lifting up Palestine has actually caused some rifts within the climate movement that I think is actually a necessary rift, right? Because I think that there's climate activism that is still very pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist, and that's not going to get it done. It's just not right. And so there are some folks obviously that do fit into both buckets of being in solidarity with Palestinians and of being involved, but I don't know of a lot of organizations that have taken that leap, which it might mean we need new organizations, in that venue. Um, all right. Yeah, so ageism, I think this is a really important thing too. Thank you, Amy. Um, of also, I mean, and I know I have my own shortcomings and biases, and I've got enough gray hair that I certainly shouldn't be ageist against people that are older than me. But also, yeah, I think that's an important comment. Both ageism of people older than us and younger than us. I mean, I have a lot of critiques of folks younger than me too, and a lot of times I just need to shut up and keep it to myself and let kids deal with kids' business. Um, yeah, so that's a good. So I've seen some people do this, and I'm trying to think. I mean, I think the Red Nation does some work around all of these different areas, and so that might be a place to go to look for some of that. There was a piece I saw the other day, and I don't know where to point you to for it, but look for it. But it was like discussing the Nakba as a climate catastrophe, and so yeah, there's people doing that. I also would say like Ali Kadri's work around waste, and folks like Max Isle. I mean, Max Isle can make those connections as well, very well. And hopefully we're gonna have him back on soon. He's got a part two of his kind of piece. He did a part one a while ago, not for us, although he did have a conversation with us in October. But he's written a couple pieces, kind of overview of, I think it's called Palestine's Great Flood is the way that his piece was called. He had part one and then part two's coming out. So we're gonna have him back on hopefully soon once that comes out. And he would be a really good person for us to have conversations around the intersections, for lack of a better term, between climate justice and Palestine and political education around this. Absolutely. Um, yeah, yeah. She's definitely losing clout quickly, but I mean, how many followers does she have too, right? Like, but yeah, no, it's true that when you start to draw those connections of, whatever you're organizing around in capitalism and imperialism, then, you're gonna lose popularity. She did have an organization, and I think she may have been kicked out of it, or yeah, I don't wanna speak to that, but yeah, um, hopefully a new one. Uh, alright. Alright, I think I'm good there. I appreciate everybody for your time listening to me rant for, the last 2 hours and go through some aspects of some counterinsurgency manuals, a little bit of tip of the spear. Hopefully, this was somewhat coherent. I realize it was a little bit disjointed at times, but maybe we'll do it again if people like it. Let me know. Send me a note or drop a comment. And much appreciated. Next week we will be back. What do we have next week? Um, I have to confirm, but, we have a couple of things uh, that are coming up. One is there's a couple of new books on policing, that we will be doing a conversation about on Thursday, I believe. It's not on the schedule yet, but I'll get it up there. Um, and then I think there's something actually I'm trying to put together a conversation with Kai Heron, who wrote a recent piece for on Verso's blog that is also about climate and imperialism, And it may actually, I haven't read the piece yet. I'll read it before I interview him, obviously, but it may actually have some connection to Palestine too. I wouldn't be surprised at that given current events. So um, appreciated. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for the kind words, Akuya and everybody else. And hopefully, last plug. Uh, I think there's a link in the show description to the study group. If there is not, you can find it on our Patreon. You do have to be a patron to join it. However, I do make exceptions if anybody can't afford it. So I'll just put my email as a banner real quick, in case anybody wants more information or um, needs also an accommodation because they can't afford the fee. But you can do it for as little as really $1 because you could sign up for, I'm telling people the secret, but you could sign up for a month and then cancel, and I would still call it good. And but you could also do a yearly, um, become a yearly patron, and that's like $11 basically, and gets you access for a year. And the patron, I think, becoming a patron is useful, because we do stuff across multiple different platforms nowadays with YouTube as well as the audio stuff. It's like one place where you can kind of see everything. And I'm sure we'll be putting out stuff with Josh's book is coming out this summer. So I'm sure we'll have stuff on that as well. And so it's a good place to kind of follow our work as well. And obviously it really helps us in terms of supporting the work that we do. All right. That's it, folks. Thanks again.